Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch, in Yoredeah 116, says that when there is a plague in the city, one should run away from the city and not wait till the end of the plague, but run away at the very beginning. And the Rabbi Mordechai comments, and in all these matters, one should take danger seriously, because danger is even more serious and stringent than prohibitions. Now, I'm not suggesting people run away from the city, because that is not the effective technique now. But what the Code of Jewish Law tells us is that we must heed medical advice and we must take precautions in the case of diseases, in the case of plagues, and so on and so forth. In fact, Rabbi Mordechai himself, in the introduction to his commentary on the Scroll of Esther, writes that during the time of a plague in Krakow, this was in the 16th century, he and his family had to run away to a city called Shidlov. He says where there was no food, there was very minimum water, shelter was at a minimum. He was a wealthy man, but in exile in Shidlov, he was living as a pauper, and he could not celebrate Purim properly. But he did heed his own advice. And one of the commentaries, Rabbi Akiva Becher, cites Rabbeinu Bachai. Rabbi Akiva Becher himself, by the way, has a very famous response to plague, a cholera epidemic in his time in the 19th century, 1831, in which he suggests small groups only for prayers. He actually requests that a policeman be stationed outside the synagogues to make sure not too many people come in. He says people should maintain proximity to each other. They should open their windows, change their clothes frequently, wash frequently, etc. Very sage and advanced advice, especially for his time in 1831. In any case, Rabbi Akiva Becher cites Rabbeinu Bachai. Rabbeinu Bachai, in his commentary on Chumash, asks an interesting question. He says, why does God tell Jews to separate themselves from the Korach, who is an evil he was a leader of a rebellion against Moses? God struck him and his community down with a plague, etc. So we are told that they should separate themselves, stay away from Korach and his community. Rabbeinu Bachai asks, why? Doesn't God have the ability to distinguish between one person and another? You could have 1,000 people dying around this person. He could be okay. Rabbeinu Bachai gives two answers. He says, number one, he says, sometimes a plague, there is infection which travels in the air. There is infection which travels in means that we don't necessarily see, much like we know today about microbes and germs and so on and so forth. And he says, and therefore one is not protected unless one separates themselves and one isolates themselves from the disease. And he says, secondly, sometimes there is a rule that when there is a decree of judgment, it comes as a general decree and does not distinguish between the righteous and the evil. And he says, therefore, a person must isolate themselves, separate themselves from the trouble, because even if they are righteous, they may be struck, God forbid, by the midat hadin, the attribute of judgment and justice, which is in the world. That is Rabbi Akiva Becher's quote of Rabbeinu Bachai. It's interesting, there was a Rabbi, Shlomo ben Shimon Duran, who was in Algiers in the 16th century, where there was indeed some type of outbreak. I believe it was also cholera. And there he asks a slightly different question. He says, if you are judged for life and death on Rosh Hashanah, on the day of judgment, he says, then why bother running away when there's a plague? If God decreed life, you'll live anyway. If God decreed death, the person will die anyway, God forbid. And his answer is that not everyone is judged for life and death on Rosh Hashanah. People are judged for a whole manner of things. Some people, if a person has not done a sin which incurs a shortening of life, they have not done a mitzvah which is rewarded by a lengthening of life, then they have a natural lifespan. That natural lifespan, determined by many, many different factors, is not affected by Rosh Hashanah. And he says, so a person who was not judged for life and death on Rosh Hashanah, only judged for other things like children, income, health, etc., such a person is what he calls efshar, meaning in the realm of possibilities. And in the realm of possibilities, he says, if a person doesn't take care of their health, then God forbid their lifespan could be shortened. If they take care of their health, then they will live their normal, natural lifespan. If they run away or isolate themselves from the disease, they'll survive. If they don't, they will not. And so it's interesting, he says both of these sources, both justifying that which the Code of Jewish Law says, to take precautions, to isolate oneself, and to do what is medically required. I hope that everyone will have those who are sick will have a complete healing, or a refuah shlema, and we will get through this, God willing.